In the vast expanse of the Galactic Federation, where 1,000 species boast of their intellectual superiority and academic achievements, there exists a peculiar anomaly. The humans, those crude, violent primates from a backwater planet, somehow possess the most feared military reputation in known space. Every alien child learns to whisper fearfully about human tactics, human resilience, and human fury in battle. Yet these same humans, when they enter the Federation's prestigious universities and research institutions, are dismissed as intellectual inferiors. They struggle with advanced quantum mathematics that young Centaurian pupils master effortlessly. They fumble through dimensional physics that crystalline scholars solve in their sleep. They are mocked, ignored, and often failed by professors who cannot understand how such simple minds could possibly belong to the species that has never lost a war. But what happens when the classroom becomes a battlefield? What occurs when theoretical knowledge meets practical application? And what will the galaxy discover about human intelligence when survival itself becomes the ultimate examination? This is the story of Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a human who carries the weight of his species' military glory while bearing the shame of academic failure. A soldier who can outthink enemy generals but cannot solve a simple equation. A warrior whose mind works in ways the galaxy has never seen before, and whose unconventional intelligence will either save the Federation or destroy everything they think they know about what it means to be smart. The greatest lesson is about to begin, and, for once, humanity will be teaching the class. Lieutenant Marcus Chen sat in the back row of advanced quantum military strategies, his weathered hands gripping a stylus that felt foreign compared to the plasma rifle he was more accustomed to holding. Around him, the lecture hall buzzed with the confident chatter of alien cadets, Centaurians with their crystalline thought processes, Valkyrie whose 4 brains could process information simultaneously, and Threscians whose psychic abilities allowed them to absorb knowledge directly from their instructors. The human section of the academy was small, barely 24 students scattered throughout the massive institution. Most aliens wondered why humans were even allowed to attend, given their consistent academic failures. The only reason the Federation tolerated their presence was simple: no one could argue with results on the battlefield. Professor Veltar, a towering Arcturian with multiple sensory organs, projected complex holographic equations into the air above the lecture pit. The mathematical formulations twisted and evolved, showing theoretical battle scenarios across 11 dimensions. Marcus watched his classmates furiously taking notes, their various appendages moving in perfect synchronization as they recorded every nuance of the professor's explanation. Marcus, however, found himself drifting. Not from boredom, but from a different kind of engagement altogether. While his classmates focused on memorizing the equations, Marcus was visualizing the actual battles they represented. He could see the tactical weaknesses in the formations, the supply line vulnerabilities that the mathematics suggested but never explicitly stated, the psychological factors that no equation could account for. Cadet Chen, Professor Veltar's voice cut through his thoughts like a plasma beam. Perhaps you could enlighten us with your understanding of the Corinthian maneuver as expressed in this 17-variable equation? Marcus felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up his neck. Every eye in the lecture hall turned toward him, some curious, most contemptuous. The Corinthian maneuver was considered one of the most elegant tactical solutions in military history, developed by the mathematically gifted Corinthians 3 centuries ago. The equation floating above him might as well have been written in an ancient dead language. Marcus began, then stopped. He could feel the judgment radiating from his classmates. The Centaurian in front of him actually turned around to smirk, her crystal-like features reflecting the ambient light and patterns that Marcus had learned indicated amusement among her species. The equation is quite straightforward, Cadet Chen, Professor Veltar continued, his tone carrying the patronizing patience reserved for the intellectually inferior. Perhaps if humans spent more time studying theory and less time charging blindly into combat, you might grasp concepts that other species master in their equivalent of elementary school. A ripple of laughter spread through the hall. Marcus felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain silent. This was nothing new. 3 years at the academy had taught him that his reputation as a human preceded him everywhere. In the eyes of his instructors and classmates, humans were violent savages who somehow stumbled into military victories through sheer brutality and luck. What they didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Marcus could see the flaw in the Corinthian maneuver. Not through mathematics, but through something deeper. The maneuver assumed that enemy forces would behave according to logical parameters, that they would respond to tactical pressure in predictable ways. But Marcus knew that real battles were messy, emotional, and filled with variables that no equation could account for. The Corinthians had used their famous maneuver exactly once in actual combat. They had been utterly destroyed by a human admiral named Sarah Rodriguez, who had completely ignored the mathematical optimal response and, instead, did something so unexpected, so contrary to established tactical doctrine, that the Corinthian fleet simply couldn't adapt. But, explaining that would require Marcus to admit he couldn't solve the equation, while also claiming to see flaws that the galaxy's greatest military theorists had missed. It was a conversation that would only lead to more humiliation. "I don't understand the equation, Professor," Marcus said finally, his voice steady despite the shame burning in his chest. More laughter. Professor Veltar's sensory organs twitched in what Marcus recognized as disappointment. "Indeed. Please see me after class, Cadet Chen. We need to discuss whether you're truly suited for advanced tactical studies." The rest of the lecture passed in a blur. Marcus tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering to actual battles he'd studied, not the sanitized theoretical versions presented in class, but the messy, chaotic, bloody reality of combat where human forces consistently achieved the impossible. The Battle of Proxima Gate, where outnumbered human defenders had held off a Thracian invasion fleet for 3 weeks using tactics that violated every principle of conventional warfare. The siege of Kepler Station, where human marines had improvised weapons from mining equipment and turned a space station into an impregnable fortress. In every case, human victories came not from superior technology or mathematical precision, but from something the Academy couldn't quantify: adaptability, creativity, and a stubborn refusal to accept that certain situations were hopeless. When the lecture ended, Marcus remained seated as his classmates filed out, many of them shooting him pitying or contemptuous looks. The Zentorian who had smirked at him earlier actually paused at his row. "Perhaps you should consider switching to a more appropriate field of study," she said, her crystalline voice carrying perfect mathematical harmony. "I hear the Academy offers excellent courses in basic logistics. Much more suited to human intellectual capacity." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Thanks for the suggestion." She seemed surprised by his calm response, having clearly expected anger or defensiveness. After a moment, she shrugged and continued toward the exit, already dismissing him from her thoughts. Finally, the lecture hall was empty except for Marcus and Professor Veltar, who was organizing his holographic displays with the methodical precision of his species. The Arcturian's multiple sensory organs focused on Marcus with uncomfortable intensity. "Cadet Chen, in 3 years at this academy, your theoretical scores have consistently ranked in the bottom 5% of all students. Your mathematical comprehension appears to be fundamentally limited, and your grasp of advanced tactical concepts is, to be generous, rudimentary." Marcus nodded, having heard variations of this speech many times before. "However," Professor Veltar continued, "I have reviewed your practical exercise performance, and I must admit to being puzzled. In simulation battles, when paired with other students who vastly exceed your theoretical understanding, you consistently emerge victorious. Your tactical decisions often violate established doctrine, yet they prove effective. How do you explain this contradiction?" It was a question Marcus had been asked before, by professors, by fellow cadets, by commanding officers during his brief periods of active duty. How could someone so apparently stupid in the classroom be so effective in practice? "I don't know, Professor," Marcus answered honestly. "I just see things differently, I suppose." "Differently how?" Marcus struggled to find words for something he'd never fully understood himself. "When I look at a battle scenario, I don't see equations. I see people. Scared people, angry people, people making decisions under stress. I see supply lines that stretch too far, commanders who might crack under pressure, soldiers who might do something heroic or cowardly or completely unexpected. Math can predict what should happen, but it can't predict what will happen." Professor Veltar's sensory organs twitched in a pattern Marcus couldn't interpret. "But surely you understand that tactical doctrine exists for a reason. These mathematical models have been refined over centuries by the greatest military minds in the galaxy. They represent the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 species." "Yes, sir. And I'm sure they work perfectly when fighting enemies who follow the same rules. Are you suggesting that human tactical methods are superior to established galactic doctrine? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Marcus knew that any claim of human tactical superiority would be met with derision, possibly disciplinary action. After all, how could a species that couldn't master basic quantum mathematics possibly develop superior military theory? I'm not suggesting anything, Professor. I just know that when humans fight, we don't always do what we're supposed to do. Sometimes we do what we have to do instead. Professor Veltar was quiet for a long moment, his alien mind processing this response. Finally, he spoke again. There will be a practical examination next week. A large-scale tactical simulation involving all advanced students. Given your theoretical deficiencies, I expect you to perform poorly. However, if you somehow manage to distinguish yourself, I will reconsider my assessment of your academic future. Thank you, Professor. Do not thank me yet, Cadet Chen. The simulation will be based on the Siege of Xerion, one of the most complex military scenarios in recorded history. It requires not just tactical acumen, but deep understanding of multidimensional physics, xenopsychology, and advanced logistics. It is precisely the kind of examination where theoretical knowledge is essential. Marcus felt his stomach sink. The Siege of Xerion was legendary, a battle so complex that it was studied by military academies across the galaxy as the ultimate test of strategic thinking. It involved 7 different species, each with unique psychological and technological characteristics, fighting across multiple star systems simultaneously. The mathematical models required to analyze even a portion of the battle filled entire data libraries. I understand, Professor. I hope you do, Cadet Chen. Because if you fail this examination as badly as I expect you will, I will have no choice but to recommend your dismissal from the academy. As Marcus walked back to his dormitory, his mind raced through everything he knew about the Siege of Xerion. It had taken place 200 years ago, involving a confederation of alien species attempting to break a massive siege engine that had locked down an entire star system. The siege had lasted 4 years and ended with the complete destruction of the defending forces. What made the battle particularly infamous was that it represented everything the galaxy considered mathematically perfect in warfare. Every move had been calculated, every response predicted, every outcome modeled to 17 decimal places. It was considered the ultimate vindication of scientific military theory. The only problem was that Marcus knew something about the Siege of Xerion that wasn't in any of the Academy textbooks. He knew why the defenders had really lost, and it had nothing to do with mathematical precision or tactical brilliance. They had lost because they were fighting a human. Admiral Elena Vasquez had been the only human present at Xerion, serving as a low-ranking tactical advisor to the Confederation forces. According to official records, her contributions had been minimal, her human limitations making her unsuitable for high-level strategic planning. She had been relegated to managing supply convoys and coordinating communications between different species, grunt work that kept her out of the way of more intellectually capable commanders. But Marcus had read Admiral Vasquez's personal logs, declassified only recently as part of his research into human military history. The truth was very different from the official version. Vasquez hadn't been managing supply lines, she had been studying the siege engine, looking for weaknesses that the mathematical models couldn't detect. She had found one. The siege engine wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. The species that built it were proving their mathematical and engineering superiority to the galaxy. They had created something so perfect, so theoretically unassailable, that breaking it seemed impossible. Every calculation supported its invincibility. Except Admiral Vasquez had realized that the engine's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It was so mathematically perfect that it couldn't adapt to truly irrational behavior. She had spent 4 years secretly preparing a plan so tactically insane, so contrary to every principle of warfare, that the siege engine's defensive systems simply couldn't predict or counter it. On the final day of the siege, when the Confederation forces were on the verge of complete collapse, Admiral Vasquez had implemented her plan. She had convinced the commanders to let her try one last desperate gambit, claiming it was based on human tactical doctrine they wouldn't understand. What she actually did was evacuate the entire civilian population of the star system into cargo ships, arm them with improvised weapons, and send them in a coordinated attack against the siege engine's mathematical blind spot, a weakness that existed not in its engineering, but in the psychological assumptions built into its targeting systems. The siege engine had been programmed to prioritize threats based on tactical value and mathematical probability. It couldn't comprehend an attack by untrained civilians using improvised weapons in a formation that violated every principle of military logic. By the time its systems adapted to the irrational assault, the blind spot had been exploited and the engine destroyed. The official records credited the victory to the brilliant tactical analysis of the Confederation's Centaurian generals, with Admiral Vasquez receiving only a minor commendation for logistical support. The truth that a human's fundamentally irrational thinking had achieved what centuries of mathematical modeling could not was buried in classified files that wouldn't be opened for decades. But Marcus knew the truth. And, more importantly, he understood it. As he reached his dormitory, Marcus realized that Professor Veltar had unknowingly given him exactly the challenge he needed. The Siege of Xirion wasn't just a test of theoretical knowledge, it was a perfect example of the fundamental difference between human intelligence and the mathematical precision that the rest of the galaxy worshipped. The question was whether he could find a way to demonstrate that difference without failing the examination completely. Because if he was going to save his academic career, he would have to do something that seemed impossible, prove that human thinking wasn't inferior to alien intelligence, it was just so completely different that the galaxy had never learned how to measure it properly. Marcus spent the next 3 days in the Academy's archives, diving deeper into records that most students never bothered to access. While his classmates focused on studying the mathematical models and tactical theories surrounding the Siege of Xirion, Marcus was researching something entirely different: the psychological profiles of every species involved, the personal histories of key commanders, and, most importantly, the classified human intelligence reports that had been overlooked by galactic historians. The Academy's library was a marvel of alien engineering, with data storage systems that could hold the collective knowledge of thousands of civilizations. Holographic displays floated throughout the vast space, allowing students to access information through thought interface systems designed for dozens of different alien neural patterns. Marcus, lacking the sophisticated mental architecture of his classmates, had to rely on the crude manual interfaces designed for primitive species. On the second day of his research, he was joined by an unexpected companion. Zarathes, a young Threscian whose psychic abilities made her one of the Academy's most promising students, settled into the study alcove across from him. Her tentacle-like appendages moved gracefully as she manipulated multiple data streams simultaneously, a feat that would have required several human researchers working in coordination. "You are studying the wrong materials, human," she said without looking up from her research. Threscians could communicate through direct mental contact, making spoken language unnecessary, but they typically used verbal speech when addressing lesser species as a form of courtesy. "How do you know what I'm studying?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer. Threscian psychic abilities were limited, but they could often pick up surface thoughts from nearby minds, especially from species with simple mental patterns like humans. "Your thoughts are unusually chaotic," Zarathes replied, a note of curiosity in her translated voice. "Most students preparing for the Xirion examination focus on mathematical optimization and tactical precedence. You appear to be reading personnel files and psychological evaluations from 2 centuries ago. Why?" Marcus considered how to answer. Zarathes was one of the few alien students who had never openly mocked his academic struggles, though he suspected this had more to do with Threscian cultural politeness than any respect for human intelligence. "I'm trying to understand why the siege lasted 4 years, he said finally. "The duration is well documented," Zarathes responded, her psychic tendrils shifting in what Marcus had learned was a sign of confusion among her species. "The siege engine was mathematically optimized for efficiency. The defending forces required precisely that amount of time to develop a counter-strategy that could overcome its defensive parameters." "But that's just it," Marcus said, leaning forward. "If the math was that clear, why did it take 4 years? Why didn't the defenders figure out the solution in 4 months, or 4 weeks, or 4 days? What were they actually doing for all that time?" Zarathes was silent for a moment, her psychic abilities apparently struggling to process Marcus's thought patterns. This was something Marcus had noticed before. Alien students who could effortlessly absorb complex mathematical concepts seemed to have difficulty following human logic when it deviated from established patterns. The historical record indicates that extensive calculations were required, she said eventually. The siege engine represented unprecedented technological complexity. Mathematical analysis of its defensive systems necessarily required significant computational time. Okay, but look at this, Marcus said, manipulating his crude interface to project Admiral Vasquez's personnel file. This human officer was present for the entire siege. According to official records, she was assigned to logistics and communication duties. But look at her service history. The holographic display showed Admiral Vasquez's career progression. Graduated dead last from the Terran Naval Academy, consistently rated as intellectually limited by alien instructors, assigned to progressively less important duties as her superiors lost faith in human capabilities. By the time of the Xerian siege, she was considered so incompetent that she was essentially ignored by the Confederation command structure. Yes, Zarathes said. This confirms what we know about human cognitive limitations. Your species consistently demonstrates poor performance in theoretical analysis. But, then, look at this, Marcus continued, switching to a different file. After Xerian, Admiral Vasquez was suddenly promoted to fleet command. She went on to win 7 major engagements against superior alien forces. Either she spontaneously developed tactical genius at the age of 45, or something happened at Xerian that isn't in the official records. Zarathes leaned forward, her psychic tendrils now moving in rapid patterns that indicated intense focus. You believe there are inaccuracies in the historical documentation? I think someone lied, Marcus said bluntly. The math says the siege should have been over in months, but it took years. The Confederation had overwhelming advantages, but they kept making tactical errors that prolonged the engagement. And the final assault that broke the siege? It violated every principle of military logic, yet somehow worked perfectly. Elaborate. Marcus pulled up the tactical analysis of Xerian's final day. The holographic display showed ship movements that seemed almost random, civilian vessels moving in impossible formations, weapons deployments that made no strategic sense. Yet somehow, this chaos had achieved what 4 years of mathematical precision could not. Look at this attack pattern, Marcus said, highlighting specific movements. The civilian evacuation fleet suddenly became an assault force. They used mining equipment as weapons, cargo ships as fighters, and passenger vessels as strategic coordinators. It's completely insane. Insanity is an insufficient description, Zarathes corrected. The tactical choices represented such severe deviation from optimal strategy that they should have resulted in complete annihilation of the attacking forces. Exactly. So why did they work? Zarathes studied the display for several minutes, her psychic abilities allowing her to process the information far faster than Marcus could have managed. Finally, she spoke again. I do not understand. The mathematical models clearly indicate that this strategy should have failed catastrophically. The siege engine's defensive systems were specifically designed to counter conventional tactical approaches, but they were also programmed with predictive algorithms that should have adapted to any coherent strategy within microseconds. What if it wasn't a coherent strategy? Marcus asked. All military actions must follow coherent strategic principles. Otherwise, they are merely random violence, which cannot achieve meaningful tactical objectives. Marcus felt a familiar frustration building. This was the wall he always hit when trying to explain human military thinking to alien minds. They could not conceive of a strategy that wasn't based on mathematical optimization and logical progression. The idea that seeming chaos could be more effective than careful planning was literally incomprehensible to them. Zarathes, can I ask you something about how Threshan military doctrine works? Certainly. When your species plans a battle, how do you decide what tactics to use? Through comprehensive analysis of all relevant variables. We calculate optimal force deployment based on enemy capabilities, environmental factors, logistical constraints, and predictive modeling of probable enemy responses. Our psychic abilities allow us to coordinate these calculations across multiple minds simultaneously, achieving tactical precision impossible for non-psychic species. And that works? Of course. Threshin forces have achieved victory in 87.3% of recorded engagements. Our tactical methods represent the mathematical ideal of efficient warfare. What about the other 12.7%? Zarathes paused, her tendrils shifting in what Marcus recognized as discomfort. Anomalous results. Typically attributed to equipment failure, environmental factors not accounted for in initial calculations, or enemy possession of unexpected technological capabilities. How many of those defeats were against human forces? The pause was longer this time. Approximately 61%. So humans, who are supposedly too stupid to understand basic tactical theory, have won against Threshin mathematical precision more than half the time you fought them? Human tactical doctrine represents an anomaly that our models have difficulty accounting for. Your species' actions often appear random or illogical, making predictive analysis challenging. Marcus leaned back in his chair, pieces of understanding beginning to fall into place. That's it, isn't it? You can't beat us because you can't predict us. Your entire military philosophy depends on being able to calculate what your enemy will do, but humans don't follow the rules that make those calculations possible. This is an oversimplification, Zarathes replied, but Marcus detected uncertainty in her mental emanations. Human tactics may appear unpredictable, but all military actions must follow logical parameters. The apparent randomness likely reflects cognitive limitations that prevent humans from implementing truly optimal strategies. Or maybe, Marcus said, our cognitive limitations are actually advantages. Maybe the reason human tactics seem random is because we're not smart enough to convince ourselves that there's only one right way to do something. Before Zarathes could respond, they were interrupted by approaching footsteps. Marcus looked up to see Captain Torres, the Academy's human military liaison, walking toward their alcove. The captain's presence in the library was unusual. He typically avoided academic areas, having experienced the same intellectual condescension that plagued human students. Cadet Chen, Captain Torres said, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency of military command. I need to speak with you privately. Marcus glanced at Zarathes, who was watching the exchange with obvious curiosity. I'll be right back, he told her, then followed Captain Torres to a more secluded area of the library. I hear you're taking the Zirian examination next week, Torres said without preamble. Yes, sir. And, I hear Professor Veltar expects you to fail spectacularly. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. I suppose that's not surprising, sir. My theoretical scores have been consistently poor. Torres studied him for a moment. Chen, how much do you know about why humans are really here at the Academy? Sir? The official line is that we're here to learn advanced military theory from our galactic allies. To improve human tactical capabilities through exposure to superior alien methodologies. Torres's expression was grim. The truth is more complicated. Marcus waited, sensing that whatever Torres was about to tell him was important. 3 years ago, the Federation Council commissioned a study to determine why human forces have been so effective in recent conflicts. They wanted to understand our tactical advantages so they could be incorporated into standard Federation military doctrine. What did they find? Nothing. Or rather, they found that human military success couldn't be quantified using their analytical methods. Every time they tried to model human tactical decision-making, their computers generated error messages. They couldn't understand how we keep winning battles we should lose. Torres paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. The Federation is getting nervous, Chen. They've realized that human military capabilities represent something their science can't explain or control. There's a growing faction within the Council that believes humanity represents a potential threat to galactic stability. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. A threat? Think about it from their perspective. Every alien species in the Federation follows predictable patterns. Their military doctrine, their technological development, their social structures, everything can be modeled and understood using mathematical analysis. Humans are the only species that consistently behaves in ways their models can't predict. So they sent human students here to figure out how our minds work? Partly. But also to prove that human intelligence is fundamentally inferior to alien capabilities. Every time a human cadet fails an examination, it reinforces the Federation's belief that our military success is just luck or primitive aggression. It helps them sleep better at night. Marcus felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to assemble in his mind. And, if a human student were to succeed academically? To prove that our intelligence isn't inferior, just different? Torres smiled grimly. That would be a problem for them. A big problem. Captain, are you telling me that I'm expected to fail? That the Academy wants me to fail? I'm telling you that your success or failure next week will determine more than just your academic future. It will impact how the Federation views humanity as a whole. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. He had thought his struggle was personal, a reflection of his own intellectual limitations. Now he was learning that his academic performance was part of a larger political and philosophical battle about the nature of intelligence itself. There's something else you need to know, Torres continued. The Zirian simulation next week isn't just an academic exercise. Federation military intelligence has been modifying the scenario, adding elements that weren't part of the historical battle. They're trying to create a test that human cognitive patterns simply cannot solve. What kind of modifications? Unknown. The details are classified above my clearance level. But, I do know that several Federation species have contributed tactical scenarios specifically designed to counter human military thinking. They want to prove, once and for all, that human intelligence is insufficient for modern warfare. Marcus felt a surge of anger, followed immediately by determination. The Federation wasn't just testing his academic capabilities, they were trying to prove that his entire species was intellectually inferior. Every human student who had failed before him had unknowingly contributed to a narrative that portrayed humanity as cognitively primitive. Captain, I need to ask you something. If humans are so tactically effective in real combat, why do we consistently fail in academic simulations? Torres was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because academic simulations are designed to test theoretical knowledge and mathematical optimization. They reward the kind of thinking that alien minds excel at. But, real combat isn't theoretical, Chen. Real combat is chaotic, emotional, and full of variables that no equation can account for. So our minds work differently? Our minds work the way minds evolved to work under pressure. Alien species developed intelligence in stable environments where mathematical precision was advantageous. Humans evolved on a world where survival required adaptability, creativity, and the ability to make decisions with incomplete information. Marcus thought about his research into Admiral Vasquez, about the psychological profiles he'd been studying, about Zarathusa's confusion when confronted with illogical human tactics. The Federation thinks intelligence means being able to solve mathematical problems quickly and accurately, he said slowly. But, what if that's not the only kind of intelligence? What if human intelligence is optimized for situations where mathematical solutions don't exist? Torres nodded. Now you're beginning to understand. The question is, can you prove it? The day of the examination arrived with the crisp artificial dawn that illuminated the Academy's main combat simulation facility. Marcus stood before the massive complex, watching as his classmates streamed through the entrance with confident expressions and synchronized movements that spoke of intensive preparation. Groups of Zentorians moved in perfect mathematical harmony, their crystalline forms catching the light in calculated patterns. Threshan students communicated through rapid psychic exchanges, their tentacles weaving complex coordination gestures. Even the normally solitary Valkyrie had organized into efficient analytical clusters. Marcus walked alone. Inside the facility, the examination hall buzzed with nervous energy that felt different from typical academic anxiety. This was the culmination of 3 years of advanced tactical education, the final demonstration of strategic competence that would determine their future roles in Federation military command. For most students, success meant prestigious assignments coordinating multi-species fleets. Failure meant relegation to support roles. For Marcus, failure meant something else entirely. It meant confirming that human intelligence was fundamentally inadequate for modern warfare, contributing to a growing Federation narrative that could ultimately determine humanity's place in galactic society. Professor Veltar stood at the center of the hall, his multiple sensory organs tracking the movements of each student with typical Arcturian precision. Beside him were three other professors Marcus didn't recognize, likely Federation military advisors brought in to observe the human students' performance. "Candidates," Professor Veltar announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic enhancement systems, "today you will face the siege of Xyrian simulation. However, this version has been modified to reflect modern tactical complexities that were not present in the historical battle." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled students. Modifications to classical scenarios were unusual in advanced examinations, typically reserved for theoretical exercises rather than practical demonstrations. The simulation will incorporate advanced defensive systems based on current Federation technology, enemy forces with capabilities drawn from multiple species' tactical doctrines, and strategic challenges that require integration of all theoretical knowledge you have acquired during your time at the Academy. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The professors were stacking the deck, creating a scenario specifically designed to favor mathematical analysis and theoretical knowledge while minimizing the practical adaptability that had made Admiral Vasquez's original solution possible. "You will be assigned roles based on your academic performance," Professor Veltar continued. "The top theoretical students will command major fleet elements and coordinate overall strategy. Those with lower academic standings will be assigned support functions appropriate to their demonstrated capabilities." Marcus knew exactly where that placed him. While his classmates would be commanding fleets and making strategic decisions, he would likely be assigned to manage supply convoys or coordinate communications, exactly the role that Admiral Vasquez had been given 2 centuries earlier. The irony was not lost on him. Students were divided into teams and assigned their roles through holographic displays that materialized above each group. As Marcus had predicted, he found himself assigned to logistical coordination and communication support under the command of Zeth Kaler, a Zentaurian whose mathematical prowess had earned him the position of overall fleet commander. Marcus's team consisted of 3 other low-performing students, a nervous Arcturian who had struggled with xenopsychological theory, a Threscian whose psychic abilities were considered below average for her species, and another human named David Santos who had scored even lower than Marcus in theoretical examinations. "Well, this is humiliating," Santos muttered as they were led to their designated command station, a cramped alcove filled with communication equipment and supply management interfaces. 3 years of education, and we end up playing space truckers while the smart kids get to be admirals. The Arcturian student, whose name Marcus learned was Quindel, was examining the communication systems with obvious confusion. "These interfaces are considerably more primitive than standard Federation equipment. Why are we not utilizing quantum entanglement networks for instantaneous communication?" "Because the simulation is based on historical technology," explained Thera, the Threscian student whose inadequate psychic abilities were still far beyond human capabilities. "We must work within the technological constraints that existed during the original siege." Marcus was studying the logistical displays, but his attention was actually focused on the overall tactical situation developing around them. Through the transparent walls of their alcove, he could see the main command stations where his high-performing classmates were coordinating fleet movements and developing strategic plans. Zeth Kaler stood at the center of the primary command station, his crystalline form surrounded by holographic displays showing the complete tactical situation. The siege engine was exactly as Marcus had expected, a massive construct that defied conventional military logic, protected by defensive systems that had been enhanced far beyond their historical capabilities. "Preliminary analysis indicates optimal attack vectors along the following coordinates," Zeth Kaler announced to the assembled commanders. Mathematical formulas flowed across the displays as Zentaurian computational abilities processed thousands of variables simultaneously. "Threscian psychic coordination will enable precise timing of assault waves, while Valkyrie analytical redundancy will provide real-time tactical optimization." Marcus watched as his classmates implemented exactly the kind of strategy he had expected: mathematically perfect, theoretically sound, and completely predictable. They were treating the siege engine as a complex equation to be solved through superior calculation rather than an adaptive opponent that could learn and respond. "Chen," Zeth Kaler's voice cut through the command center's activity. "Your team will coordinate supply lines to maintain optimal resource distribution during the assault. Ensure that ammunition and fuel reserves are positioned according to the mathematical optimization protocols in your briefing materials. Understood, Marcus replied, though he was already seeing problems with the supply distribution that the mathematical models couldn't account for. The optimized positions assumed that battle lines would remain static, that ships would consume resources at predictable rates, and that enemy interference with supply convoys would follow logical patterns. In reality, space battles were chaotic affairs where supply lines became primary targets, where ships consumed resources in desperate bursts during crisis moments, and where the most important deliveries were often the ones no one had planned for. But, explaining this to Zeth Kaler would require Marcus to challenge the mathematical foundations of Federation tactical doctrine, something that his academic record gave him no credibility to attempt. Instead, he began implementing the official supply plan while secretly developing alternatives that his team could execute if the mathematical optimization failed. He assigned Santos to manage conventional supply routes while creating redundant pathways that weren't included in the official documentation. He positioned Quindal at communication nodes that would allow rapid redeployment of resources when the predictable patterns inevitably broke down. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Thera asked, her limited psychic abilities allowing her to sense that his thoughts were more complex than his assigned role suggested. "Following orders," Marcus replied, which was technically true. He was implementing the required supply distribution while also preparing for contingencies that the mathematical models hadn't considered. The simulation began with the expected precision. Federation forces deployed according to optimal mathematical patterns, their movements coordinated through perfect theoretical analysis. The siege engine responded with defensive measures that had been enhanced beyond historical accuracy, creating exactly the kind of technological challenge that favored mathematical problem-solving over tactical creativity. For the first several hours, everything proceeded according to plan. Zeth Kaler's strategies proved effective against the siege engine's conventional defenses, with Centaurian mathematical precision enabling precise targeting of identified weak points. Threshen's psychic coordination allowed perfectly timed assault waves, while Valkyrie analytical capabilities provided real-time optimization of tactical decisions. Marcus watched from his logistical station as his classmates demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual superiority that the Federation educational system was designed to cultivate. Their mathematical minds processed information faster than human cognition could match, their theoretical knowledge enabled solutions that Marcus couldn't have calculated, and their coordinated efforts represented the pinnacle of modern military science. But Marcus also noticed things that his classmates were missing. Supply convoys were taking slightly longer than predicted because the mathematical models didn't account for the psychological stress affecting alien crew members operating in combat conditions. Communication delays were accumulating as psychic networks became overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of prolonged battle. Most importantly, the siege engine was adapting to Federation tactics faster than the mathematical models had predicted. Zeth Kaler, Marcus called through the communication system. "Supply Convoy 12 is reporting unusual resistance along the predicted route. Request permission to implement alternative delivery pathways." "Negative, Chen. Maintain optimal distribution protocols. Convoy 12's difficulties are within acceptable parameters for mathematical variance." But Marcus could see that Convoy 12 was about to be destroyed. The siege engine had identified the mathematically optimal supply routes and was concentrating defensive fire along those pathways. While Zeth Kaler's equations suggested that such focused defense was tactically inefficient for the siege engine, Marcus recognized it as exactly the kind of adaptive behavior that real opponents employed when facing predictable strategies. "Santos," Marcus whispered to his teammate, "divert backup supplies along Route 7. Don't wait for authorization." "That's not in our orders," Santos replied nervously. "Route 7 isn't in the mathematical optimization, which means the siege engine won't be watching it. Convoy 12 is going to be destroyed in approximately 8 minutes, and, when that happens, the entire left flank will run out of ammunition." Santos hesitated, torn between following orders and trusting Marcus's analysis. Finally, he began quietly implementing the alternative supply route, hoping that no one would notice the deviation from protocol. Marcus turned his attention to broader patterns emerging in the battle. The siege engine was learning faster than Federation doctrine assumed possible, adapting its responses to counter each mathematical optimization as soon as the Federation forces implemented it. This was creating a tactical escalation where each side required increasingly sophisticated calculations to maintain advantage. The problem was that escalating mathematical complexity favored the siege engine, which had computational resources far beyond what the Federation fleet could match. Every time Zethkaler developed a more sophisticated strategy, the siege engine responded with an even more complex counter-strategy, forcing the Federation forces into a mathematical arms race they couldn't win. Marcus realized that his classmates were falling into the same trap that had prolonged the historical siege for 4 years. They were trying to outcalculate an opponent with superior computational capabilities rather than finding solutions that didn't depend on mathematical optimization. "Thera," he said quietly, "can you sense what Zethkaler is thinking right now?" The Threshen student focused her psychic abilities on the fleet commander's mental emanations. "He is frustrated. The mathematical models are failing to predict enemy responses accurately. He is calculating increasingly complex strategies, but each solution requires computational resources beyond our fleet's capabilities." "What about the other commanders?" "Similar patterns. They are recognizing that the siege engine's adaptive capabilities exceed Federation projections, but they cannot develop solutions that do not rely on mathematical superiority." Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the same clarity that came over him during practical exercises when mathematical analysis reached its limits and something else had to take over. His classmates were thinking their way into failure, using their intellectual superiority to convince themselves that there had to be a mathematical solution to every tactical problem. But Marcus knew that some problems couldn't be solved through calculation. Some problems required the kind of thinking that looked stupid until it worked. He began studying the siege engine's response patterns, not through mathematical analysis but through something more intuitive. He watched how it reacted to Federation strategies, looking for emotional patterns rather than logical ones. He analyzed the timing of its adaptive responses, searching for psychological rhythms that equations couldn't capture. And, gradually, he began to see something that his classmates' mathematical minds were missing. The siege engine wasn't just adapting to Federation tactics, it was learning to think like Federation commanders. It was becoming more mathematical, more logical, more precisely analytical with each engagement. Which meant it was also becoming more predictable in ways that had nothing to do with mathematics. "I need to speak with Zethkaler," Marcus announced, standing from his logistical station. "You cannot abandon your assigned position," Quindal protested. "Logistical coordination requires constant attention to supply distribution protocols." "The supply distribution is about to become irrelevant," Marcus replied, "because we're about to lose the entire fleet." He walked toward the primary command station, knowing that what he was about to suggest would either save the simulation or destroy his academic career completely. Because he was about to recommend a strategy so contrary to Federation military doctrine that it would challenge everything the galaxy believed about the nature of intelligence itself. Marcus approached the primary command station with the weight of 3 years' academic failure pressing on his shoulders. Around him, the simulation battle raged with mathematical precision as Federation forces executed increasingly sophisticated strategies against an opponent that seemed to anticipate their every move. The siege engine had evolved beyond its historical capabilities, becoming a computational nightmare that absorbed and countered each tactical innovation within minutes of its implementation. Zethkaler stood at the center of the command cluster, his crystalline form surrounded by holographic displays that showed the deteriorating tactical situation in painful detail. Zentorian mathematical analysis was being pushed to its limits as equations became so complex that even their enhanced cognitive abilities struggled to process the calculations in real time. "Commander," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the coordinated chatter of alien strategic planning. Zethkaler's sensory organs twitched in annoyance. "Chen, return to your logistical duties. We are implementing probability cascade analysis that requires complete concentration." "Commander, with respect, probability cascade analysis isn't going to work." The command station fell silent. Every alien head turned toward Marcus, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. For a human student with the worst theoretical scores in Academy history to challenge advanced Centaurian mathematical analysis was so presumptuous that it bordered on incomprehensible. "Explain your reasoning," Zethkaler said, his tone carrying the patient condescension typically reserved for addressing cognitive inferiors. Marcus gestured toward the tactical displays showing the siege engine's adaptive responses. "Look at the pattern of enemy countermeasures over the last 4 hours. Each time we implement a new strategy, the siege engine calculates an optimal response within approximately 12 minutes. But, the responses aren't just mathematical, they're learning to think like us. Obviously, interjected Verilyn, a Threshen commander whose psychic abilities had been coordinating fleet movements. Adaptive tactical systems naturally evolve more sophisticated analytical capabilities when challenged by superior strategic thinking. But, that's exactly the problem, Marcus continued. The siege engine is becoming more logical, more mathematical, more predictable. It's learning to think like Federation commanders, which means it's also inheriting the limitations of Federation tactical doctrine. Zethkaler's crystalline features shifted in patterns that Marcus recognized as intellectual confusion. Clarify this apparent contradiction. Enhanced mathematical analysis represents improved tactical capability, not limitation. Marcus felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain human logic to minds that operated on mathematical principles. Around him, his alien classmates were watching with expressions that suggested they were witnessing either a brilliant insight or a complete mental breakdown. Commander, every strategy we've implemented has been based on mathematical optimization. We calculate the optimal approach, the siege engine calculates a counter-approach, we calculate a counter-approach, and so on. We're locked in a mathematical arms race where the siege engine has computational advantages we can't match. This analysis is correct, Zethkaler acknowledged. However, mathematical precision remains our most effective tactical tool. Abandoning analytical methodology would represent cognitive regression. What if mathematical precision isn't our most effective tool? Marcus asked. What if it's just the only tool we've been trained to use? Thera, the Threshen student from Marcus's logistics team, had followed him to the command station despite orders to remain at her assigned position. Her psychic abilities were focused on Marcus's thought patterns, and her tentacles were weaving gestures of profound confusion. Marcus, she said, her translated voice carrying uncertainty, your mental emanations suggest you are contemplating tactical approaches that violate fundamental strategic principles. Such approaches cannot achieve coherent military objectives. Maybe coherent isn't what we need right now, Marcus replied. Maybe we need something so incoherent that the siege engine can't calculate a response. The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic gas. To alien minds trained in mathematical precision, the idea of deliberately implementing incoherent tactics was not just wrong, it was literally incomprehensible. It violated every principle of military science that had been developed over millennia of galactic warfare. Professor Veltar's voice cut through the command station's activity from the observation deck above. Cadet Chen, you are exceeding your assigned role and disrupting command coordination. Return to logistical duties immediately. But, Zethkaler raised one of his crystalline appendages, signaling for attention. Professor, our current strategies are achieving diminishing returns. Mathematical analysis suggests that siege engine adaptation will eventually overcome our computational capabilities regardless of tactical sophistication. Perhaps, unconventional approaches merit consideration. Marcus could barely believe what he was hearing. Zethkaler, the Academy's most mathematically gifted student, was actually willing to consider tactics that couldn't be optimized through calculation. What do you propose, Chen? Zethkaler asked. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would either vindicate human tactical thinking or confirm every stereotype about human intellectual inadequacy. We stop trying to outthink the siege engine and start acting like humans. Elaborate. Marcus gestured toward the tactical displays, but, instead of pointing at mathematical projections, he indicated the psychological profiles of fleet personnel that were buried in the logistical databases. Look at our crews. We've got Arcturian engineers who are terrified of improvisation, Threshen pilots whose psychic abilities are being overwhelmed by combat stress, Zentorian coordinators who can't function when their calculations don't work. Everyone is trying to fight like a mathematical equation, but they're not equations. They're people. Military personnel are trained to suppress emotional responses that interfere with tactical efficiency, Verilyn pointed out. Psychological factors represent sources of error, not strategic assets. But, what if psychological factors are exactly what we need? Marcus asked. What if the reason the siege engine can predict all our moves is because we're trying so hard to be logical that we've become predictable? He moved to one of the subsidiary control panels and began pulling up data that his classmates had ignored: stress reports from ship crews, communication delays caused by emotional overload, supply requests for items that weren't in the mathematical optimization models. "Look at this," he said, highlighting a series of seemingly random supply requisitions. "Engineering crews are requesting tools that aren't in the tactical database. Medical personnel are reporting psychological symptoms that don't fit standard stress patterns. Communications are showing delays that correlation analysis can't explain. These represent system inefficiencies," Zethkaler observed. "Factors to be minimized through improved coordination." Or, Marcus said, they represent human behavior. People responding to crisis in ways that no equation can predict because they're not trying to be optimal, they're just trying to survive. Marcus began manipulating the display to show a different view of the battle, one that highlighted human personnel throughout the fleet and tracked their behavior patterns over the course of the engagement. Every human crew member in this fleet has been making small decisions that deviate from mathematical optimization. Engineers improvising repairs that aren't in the manual. Pilots making course corrections based on intuition rather than navigation computers. Communications officers routing messages through informal networks rather than official channels. The display showed these deviations as chaotic noise overlaying the precise mathematical patterns of Federation strategy. To alien observers, it looked like systematic failure of human personnel to follow proper procedures. To Marcus, it looked like opportunity. "Commander, what if we stopped trying to suppress these deviations and started amplifying them? What if we built a strategy around the fact that humans don't think like computers?" Zethkaler studied the display for several minutes, his mathematical mind struggling to process the concept of deliberately introducing chaos into tactical planning. Finally, he spoke. "Chen, you are suggesting that we intentionally violate optimal strategic protocols in order to achieve what objective? Unpredictability. The siege engine has learned to counter mathematical strategies because mathematical strategies follow logical patterns. But human strategies don't follow logical patterns. They follow psychological patterns, emotional patterns, cultural patterns that no computer can model because they're not based on optimization, they're based on survival instincts that evolved in chaotic environments." Thera's psychic emanation suddenly intensified as she processed the implications of Marcus's suggestion. "You wish to implement tactics based on human evolutionary psychology rather than mathematical analysis?" "I want to implement tactics based on how humans actually fight when no one is telling them the optimal way to do it." Marcus pulled up Admiral Vasquez's classified files, displaying the psychological analysis that had been buried in Federation archives for 2 centuries. This is how Admiral Vasquez really broke the siege. She didn't outcalculate the siege engine, she outcrazied it. She convinced thousands of civilians to attack a mathematically impregnable fortress using mining equipment and cargo ships. It was so tactically insane that the siege engine's defensive systems couldn't adapt because there was nothing logical to adapt to. The command station had fallen completely silent. Marcus could feel the weight of alien attention focused on him as minds trained in mathematical precision struggled to process the concept of tactical success through deliberate irrationality. "Commander," Marcus continued, "I can implement a strategy based on human psychological patterns rather than mathematical optimization. But it will require you to trust tactics that will look completely wrong according to everything you've learned about warfare." Zethkaler's crystalline form was motionless for nearly a full minute as his mathematical mind processed probabilities and outcomes. Finally, his sensory organs focused on Marcus with unprecedented intensity. "Chen, if your unconventional approach fails, it will result in catastrophic defeat that confirms human cognitive inadequacy. If it succeeds through random chance, it will provide no reproducible tactical knowledge for future application. Either outcome appears suboptimal." "Commander," Marcus said quietly, "what if it succeeds not through random chance, but through a type of intelligence that the galaxy has never learned to measure properly?" Around him, alien minds struggled with a concept that challenged their fundamental understanding of intelligence itself. But Marcus could see something in Zethkaler's expression that he had never seen before: genuine curiosity about human cognitive capabilities rather than condescending dismissal. "Implement your strategy, Chun," Zethkaler said finally. But, understand that you are placing the outcome of this examination, and, potentially the Federation's assessment of human military value, on tactical approaches that cannot be validated through any known analytical methodology. Marcus felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. In the next few hours, he would either demonstrate that human intelligence represented a valuable addition to Federation military capabilities, or he would confirm that his species was cognitively inferior to the rest of the galaxy. But, as he began implementing a strategy based on 3 years of suppressed human instincts rather than mathematical optimization, Marcus realized something that his alien classmates couldn't understand: sometimes the most important battles weren't won by being smarter than your enemy. Sometimes they were won by being human enough to do what no logical mind would ever consider. Marcus stood at the center of the command station, surrounded by alien minds that had been trained to think in mathematical perfection, about to implement a strategy that would violate every principle of logical warfare. The irony was not lost on him that he was finally being given command authority at the moment when he planned to abandon everything that command authority traditionally represented. "All fleet elements, this is Acting Tactical Coordinator Chen," he announced through the communications system, his voice carrying to every ship in the simulation. "We are implementing immediate tactical restructuring based on unconventional operational parameters." The response was instantaneous confusion. Across the fleet, alien commanders struggled to understand how a human logistics coordinator had suddenly been elevated to tactical command, and, more importantly, what unconventional operational parameters could possibly mean. Marcus ignored the flood of questioning communications and began implementing his strategy. But, instead of issuing traditional tactical orders, he started with something no Federation commander had ever done: he told the fleet to stop trying to be perfect. "All human personnel," he broadcast on a secondary channel, "disregard optimal efficiency protocols. I want you to start doing things the way you would if no one was watching your performance ratings. Engineers, fix things however they stay fixed. Pilots, fly the way that feels right instead of the way that tests perfectly. Supply coordinators, get people what they need instead of what the computers say they should have." In the observation deck above, Professor Veltar was watching with an expression of horrified fascination as Marcus systematically dismantled 3 centuries of military doctrine. The other Federation observers were taking rapid notes, documenting what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure of human tactical capability. But something unexpected began happening in the fleet's performance metrics. The rigid mathematical precision that had characterized Federation movements started dissolving into something more fluid, more organic. Human crew members, released from the pressure to optimize every decision, began implementing solutions that no computer would have calculated. An Arcturian engineering crew, working alongside human technicians who were suddenly improvising repairs instead of following procedural manuals, discovered that mixing Federation technology with crude human modifications created systems that were less efficient but infinitely more adaptable. Threshin pilots, coordinating with human navigators who were flying on instinct rather than calculation, found that their psychic abilities became more effective when they didn't have to process optimal flight paths. Most importantly, the siege engine began struggling to predict Federation responses. Its adaptive algorithms had been designed to counter increasingly sophisticated mathematical strategies, but they couldn't model tactical decisions that weren't based on optimization principles. "Commander Chen," Zethkaler said, his crystalline voice carrying a note of wonder, "fleet efficiency has decreased by approximately 30%, but tactical unpredictability has increased beyond measurable parameters. The siege engine's response algorithms are generating error cascades." Marcus was monitoring the siege engine's defensive patterns through displays that showed psychological stress indicators rather than mathematical projections. Unlike his alien classmates, he wasn't trying to outcalculate the enemy, he was trying to outfrustrate it. "All fleet elements, implement random variations on assigned tasks," he ordered. "I want supply convoys taking scenic routes, combat squadrons pausing to help with repairs, communication officers gossiping about things that have nothing to do with the mission. Be inefficient. Be illogical. Be human." Verulin's psychic tendrils were weaving patterns of profound distress. "Chen, you are implementing tactical chaos. This cannot achieve coherent military objectives." "It's not supposed to achieve coherent objectives," Marcus replied. "It's supposed to achieve impossible ones." The siege engine's responses were becoming increasingly erratic as its computational systems struggled to model behavior that followed no logical pattern. Federation ships were moving in formations that violated tactical doctrine, engaging in combat at ranges that made no mathematical sense, and coordinating through communication networks that resembled social gossip more than military command structures. But they were also achieving something that 4 hours of mathematical precision had failed to accomplish. They were confusing the siege engine badly enough that its defensive systems were beginning to malfunction. Chen, Thera said from her position at the communications array, "I am receiving reports from human personnel throughout the fleet. They are enjoying this. Their psychological stress indicators have decreased significantly since you implemented unconventional protocols." Marcus smiled grimly. "That's because they're finally being allowed to fight like humans instead of trying to fight like computers." He turned to the tactical display and began implementing the final phase of his strategy, something so completely illogical that he knew it would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically. "All civilian personnel in the fleet," he announced, "you are now combat units. Cargo ship captains, your fighter squadron leaders. Passenger liner crews, your assault coordinators. Everyone who has no military training whatsoever, you're now in charge of the final attack." The command station erupted in protests from alien commanders who could not comprehend the concept of placing untrained civilians in combat leadership roles. But Marcus had studied Admiral Vasquez's logs carefully. The original breakthrough at Zirion had come not from military precision, but from civilian desperation channeled into tactical innovation. "Chen," Sethkaler said, his mathematical mind struggling to process what he was witnessing, "you are violating every principle of command structure and tactical competence. How can untrained personnel coordinate complex military operations?" "They can't," Marcus replied. "That's exactly why it's going to work." The siege engine's defensive systems were designed to counter military thinking, the logical progression from reconnaissance to tactical analysis to strategic implementation that characterized all known forms of warfare. But civilian minds didn't think in military terms. They thought in terms of survival, improvisation, and desperate creativity that no tactical manual could predict. Across the fleet, cargo ship captains began organizing attack formations based on supply convoy experiences rather than combat doctrine. Passenger liner crews, accustomed to managing chaotic crowds of diverse alien species, started coordinating multi-species assault teams with the casual efficiency of hospitality professionals. Mining ship operators, familiar with dangerous industrial operations in space, approached the siege engine not as a military target but as a particularly challenging engineering problem. The siege engine's response patterns began fragmenting as its adaptive algorithms encountered tactics that had no precedent in galactic military history. Its defensive systems were calibrated to counter logical strategies implemented by trained military minds, not improvised solutions developed by civilians who didn't understand why their approaches shouldn't work. "Chen," Professor Veltar's voice cut through the command station's activity from the observation deck, "explain the theoretical foundation for these tactical decisions." Marcus looked up at the professor, then at the assembled Federation observers who were documenting what they had expected to be a demonstration of human inadequacy. "Professor, there is no theoretical foundation. That's the point." He gestured toward the tactical displays, which now showed Federation forces moving in patterns that resembled complex dance more than military maneuvers. "For 3 years, you've been testing human students on our ability to think like you. But we're not you. We're not mathematical optimization engines or logical processing systems. We're humans. Clarify the distinction," Professor Veltar demanded. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either change how the Federation understood intelligence or confirm their worst assumptions about human cognitive capacity. "Professor, your species developed intelligence to solve mathematical problems efficiently. You created minds that could calculate optimal solutions to complex challenges. But humans developed intelligence to survive impossible situations. We created minds that could find solutions when optimal answers didn't exist." On the tactical displays, civilian-led assault teams were approaching the siege engine using strategies that violated every principle of military logic. Mining ships were treating the fortress like an asteroid to be extracted rather than a target to be destroyed. Passenger liners were coordinating with the chaotic efficiency of managing interstellar tourism. cargo vessels were improvising assault tactics based on loading dock operations. The siege engine's defensive systems were failing not because they were being overwhelmed by superior firepower, but because they couldn't predict responses to attacks that had no logical foundation. Your mistake, Marcus continued, addressing not just Professor Veltar but the entire Federation academic establishment that had dismissed human intelligence as primitive, is assuming that intelligence means thinking efficiently. But sometimes intelligence means thinking effectively. Sometimes the most intelligent response to an impossible situation is to do something so stupid that it works. Zethkaler was monitoring the siege engine's deteriorating defensive patterns with an expression approaching awe. Shen, the siege engine's adaptive algorithms are experiencing complete computational breakdown. Its systems cannot model tactical responses that follow no logical progression. Because it's trying to outthink us, Marcus replied. But you can't outthink someone who isn't thinking, you can only outfeel them, out-improvise them, out-human them. The final assault began not with coordinated precision but with chaotic determination. Civilian crews attacked the siege engine using tactics that military minds would never have considered, cargo ships ramming defensive installations not because it was strategically optimal but because it felt satisfying, passenger liners evacuating siege engine personnel instead of destroying them because hospitality instincts overrode combat doctrine. Mining vessels treating the fortress's defensive systems like ore veins to be carefully extracted rather than barriers to be overcome. The siege engine's final defensive gambit was a massive computational effort to model and counter the Federation's chaotic tactics. Its systems devoted enormous processing power to analyzing human behavior patterns, trying to find the mathematical foundation that would allow it to predict and neutralize civilian improvisation. It was exactly what Marcus had hoped would happen. While the siege engine's computational resources were overwhelmed trying to understand tactics that had no logical foundation, its defensive systems became vulnerable to conventional assault. The mathematical precision that alien minds excelled at could finally be applied effectively because the siege engine was too busy trying to solve the puzzle of human irrationality. Zethkaler's crystalline form was surrounded by holographic displays showing the siege engine's structural collapse as Federation forces exploited the computational distraction that human chaos had created. Shen, Zethkaler said, his voice carrying wonder, your strategy achieved tactical victory through deliberate cognitive inefficiency. This contradicts fundamental principles of military science. No, Marcus replied, watching as the simulation concluded with Federation victory achieved through the combination of alien mathematical precision and human adaptive chaos. It demonstrates that military science has been incomplete. You've been studying only one type of intelligence while ignoring others that might be equally valuable. Professor Veltar descended from the observation deck, his multiple sensory organs focused on Marcus with unprecedented intensity. Around them, alien students were struggling to process what they had witnessed, a tactical victory achieved through approaches that violated every principle of their education. Cadet Shen, Professor Veltar said slowly, your performance in this examination has been illuminating. However, I am uncertain how to evaluate tactics that cannot be reproduced through analytical methodology. Marcus met the professor's gaze steadily. Professor, maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason humans keep winning battles we should lose isn't because we're smarter than you, but because we're different from you. Maybe intelligence isn't just about calculating the right answer, maybe sometimes it's about finding answers that no calculation could ever discover. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's performance at the Zirian simulation would be analyzed by Federation military theorists, academic institutions, and xenopsychological researchers throughout known space. Some would dismiss his success as an anomaly, evidence that even primitive tactical approaches could occasionally succeed through chance. Others would argue that human cognitive patterns represented a valuable supplement to traditional mathematical analysis. But Marcus knew the truth that his classmates and professors were struggling to accept: human intelligence wasn't inferior to alien cognition, it was orthogonal to it. While other species had developed minds optimized for efficiency and logical precision, humans had evolved minds optimized for adaptation and creative problem-solving in impossible situations. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to measure human intelligence using standards designed for mathematical minds, concluding that humans were cognitively inferior because they couldn't compete with species whose mental architecture was fundamentally different. It was like testing a fish's intelligence by measuring its ability to climb trees. 3 months later, Marcus graduated from the academy with academic scores that remained in the bottom 5% of his class. His theoretical knowledge was still considered inadequate by Federation standards, his mathematical abilities still ranked far below those of his alien classmates. But, his practical performance had changed how the Federation military approached tactical education. Human students were no longer expected to master alien methodologies, instead, they were trained to contribute uniquely human perspectives to multi-species command structures. The Academy developed new courses in adaptive tactical thinking and non-mathematical strategic analysis that attempted to codify human military psychology for alien minds to understand. Captain Torres found Marcus on graduation day, standing outside the Academy's main complex and looking up at the star-filled sky that represented humanity's future in galactic society. "So, Chen, how does it feel to prove that human intelligence isn't inferior after all?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't think I proved that we're not inferior, Captain. I think I proved that inferior and superior don't mean what we thought they meant." "Explain." Every species in the Federation developed intelligence to solve the problems their environments presented. Centaurians needed mathematical precision for their crystal-based technology. Threscians needed psychic coordination for their hive-like society. Arcturians needed sensory analysis for their complex perceptual world. Marcus gestured toward the stars above them. But, humans developed intelligence to survive on a planet where the problems kept changing faster than any mathematical solution could be calculated. We needed minds that could improvise, adapt, and find solutions that had never existed before. And, now the galaxy is discovering that space is more like Earth than they realized. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and full of problems that have never been solved before. Mathematical precision is incredibly valuable, but it's not the only kind of intelligence that matters. Captain Torres smiled. "So what's next for you, Lieutenant Chen?" Marcus looked at the graduation certificate in his hands, a document that officially recognized his completion of Federation military education while noting his continued deficiencies in theoretical analysis. It was a perfect symbol of his academic experience, officially successful, but with the quiet understanding that his success had come through methods that the system couldn't quite approve of. "I'm going to do what humans have always done, Captain. I'm going to find problems that everyone says can't be solved, and then, I'm going to solve them in ways that everyone says shouldn't work." Above them, the stars twinkled with the light of 1,000 different civilizations, each believing that their approach to intelligence was the correct one. But, Marcus knew that the universe was big enough for many different types of intelligence, and complex enough that solving its challenges would require every kind of mind the galaxy could produce. The greatest lesson had indeed been taught, and, for once, humanity had been the teacher. But, the real education was just beginning, as the galaxy slowly learned that intelligence came in more forms than any mathematical equation could ever calculate.